to another edition of the Diversified Semantic Layer podcast. Visible Layer, this is Eric Fallow, and I'm joined all the way from Western Australia by my pal Josh Fletcher. Good evening,
Hello.
Josh.
Hey.
We're kicking it live once again with our continuation of our Universe Design Hacks episode that we did with Dave Rathbun and Derek Loranca. So we're gonna continue the nerdiness and with an episode on measures. Josh, you want to set us up a little bit?
Yep. So dimensions are really easy to build in your universe. You basically create the object, map it to a column, and that incurs a group by in your SQL statements. But measures are a little bit more tricky because what we're doing is we're trying to aggregate data by the dimensions we combine that measure with and return the correct results for the user. And there's a couple of benefits to using aggregation with our measures. Is one, we're telling the universe, or the universe is able to generate SQL that is not only valid, but also aggregates the data correctly, and so returns a smaller data set than what our user needs to. They don't need the raw data, they just need an aggregated data set because they want to look at sales by country. But in the measure definition, what we're also doing is telling it how to further aggregate that data set within the report. So it's very important that we get that aggregation at the database correct, as well as at the report layer.
Indeed. So I think as we talk about today, we're in large part talking about the relational database customer. Fair statement?
Yes, correct, we are. Yeah. So standard, standard universe design, Oracle.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
If you're here looking for better measures in BW, this is the wrong episode for you. All right, so I guess we'll kick it off by sharing my information design tool window where Josh and I have started a sweet little universe. So continuing the theme, which is based upon your freely included auditor data with your SAP Business Objects platform. We've dropped the simplest grain of data we could, the event. That was when somebody viewed a report or refreshed a report or scheduled a report. And then on top of that, we let it auto-generate a single folder of objects based on the select statements of each of those columns in our database. So to kick that off, we need a measure. Where are we going, Josh?
So, what I wanted to actually talk about first, Eric, if you can expand the ADS event folder back out, if we maybe copy the duration milliseconds down to the measures folder, copy that object. What I wanted to highlight first was that in the information design tool, I think this is a great feature of IDT, is that you can right-click a dimension object and turn that into a measure. And by default, it will create it with an aggregation function. So we can see there, by right-clicking, we can turn that into a sum. And yep, let's do it. And if we look at what happens to our object, first of all, we get the little orange ruler there, obviously, but the select statement in the SQL definition is what we're most interested in to start with. So you can see here what it's doing is it's doing a sum of the duration millisecond column from the ADS event table. And what that's going to do is incur a group by with any objects it's combined with, and it's also going to summarize that object. The next thing to take note of is the projection function, which is just above that select clause, and that is telling us what aggregation is going to happen when this measure is used in a Webby report, as an example. So if you can imagine maybe our query has username and timestamp and has the sum of the duration. The sum of the duration is aggregated to the username and timestamp at the database level, and the data that's returned is that kind of 3-column virtual table data provider. When we grab the measure object and the username and we put that into a block in our Webby report, it's going to further summarize that duration, those duration rows up into another group by the username, and that's exactly the functionality we want.
Should we do a bit of a...
I'll let you get a word in edgewise, Eric, sorry.
Maybe we should be a little bit illustrative. So
sure.
In terms of what Josh is referring to, if we take something simple like the event type ID and the server ID, so this would give us a distribution, and if we use the appropriate decode tables inside of Auditor, we'd be able to get the event descriptions and the server descriptions. But based on what Josh has described, it will summarize the data to that grain, given the fact that we've told it to do the sum, and use the aggregation inside of the report. So the roll-ups will happen automatically inside of, say, Webby, for example, as you slice and dice this data.
So what this means is especially if you're working with large data sets, is, your raw data might be millions, tens of millions, 100 millions of records. And if a user decides to query across of all time, but they want to roll up, duration by the year, they're only going to get, several records instead of that 100 million. And that's exactly the functionality we want 99.9% of the time. We want the user to be working with an aggregated data set. If they are wanting to get raw data, then that's where they can include a ID column. So if they grab the event ID, that would still give them the raw data, but they're having to manually choose to do that. So they're having to define the lowest level of granularity that they want by the objects they select, not just getting it by default. And everyone wins. Everyone wins in that statement, in that scenario, right? Because your DBAs are going to go, you're hammering my database server by querying all this data, and it's ad hoc usage, right? And then your network administrators are going to get, cranky because you're transferring huge amounts of data across the network when you don't need to.
And not to mention the strain on your business objects landscape. The larger the microcube, the more work that it has to do in allowing you to slice and dice that data.
And finally, it's going to wreck the performance of your client server if you're using, or the client machine if you're using Webby Rich Client. It's having to return all that data to the client, and your client might be just a it's probably, I was going to say XP machine, but it probably isn't anymore, right? So this is exactly the functionality we want. We want it to do this group by, we want it to summarize, and that's using standard database functionality.
Yep. So I think just to illustrate the converse, maybe it makes sense to show without the aggregation on, maybe using delegated measures.
Yeah, I guess, what we wanted to go through was, so delegator won't do it, but if we, or sorry, maybe you're trying to show something else, but what I was wanting to show is if you remove that database aggregation function, so it's still a measure object, but you tell it to do the ADS event duration millisecond, cool, and leave that as a sum. This is a mistake that universe developers have made in the past that I've seen in universes where I've worked with clients. If we just repeat that same query, Eric, and we look at the SQL that's generated, you can see there it's just returning the raw data. Even though it's going to treat it like a measure once it gets into the report, this is going to return just the raw data. So like we said in that example, you might be blowing the query out from tens or hundreds of records out to tens of thousands or millions of records because you're not taking advantage of the database aggregation capability.
And further, as a good universe designer, you've found the appropriate justification to keep your users from getting unlimited rows from your universe. It's a surefire way to let a user destroy a Webby processing server, for example, by pulling back too much data from a table like this.
And if you look at if the user was to choose these objects, they're not getting any value from having that at a raw, level of granularity, right? Like the unique combination of server ID, event type ID, and duration millisecond doesn't really give them any information unless they wanted to count it, but there's not even a unique ID that can count. There's not an event ID, right? So there's no purpose in them having this amount of data. And like we said, if they did want the raw level of data, then they could choose, one of the ID columns to give them that low level of granularity.
Indeed.
So the converse is also a problem. We can't demo it without going into Webby and stuff, and we're probably too lazy. But just to talk through that, if you did aggregate it at the database level correctly, but then you change the projection function to be none, no aggregation, the data is actually not going to, the data provider is not going to perform correctly according to what the user expects. They see this total duration measure and they think, oh, well, if I pull that into the report and then I can, slice and dice it, oh, hang on, it's not actually doing what I want. It's returning it, I maybe put in the duration alongside the username, but I get one record for every timestamp. That doesn't, it doesn't actually give them the data set they want in the report. Business objects, all the reporting clients are designed to use measures the way that we just described in the best practice way, with aggregation set at both the database level and at the projection level. And if you don't do that, you're going to get, either incorrect queries at the database level or not performant queries, or you're going to get issues with your reporting.
So know your measures. I think
one more thing, it's very important. Sorry, you go first.
No, I was gonna bring it to a close. What do you got?
One thing that I remember I wanted to mention in this is you might think that it's okay to or some people might think that it's okay to have some measures that don't have database aggregation function. Can you please create another one for me? Maybe count the event ID as a measure as well.
All right. So we're going to
do one from scratch, or copy it. That's going to be quicker.
We'll do. All right.
And hopefully you'd understand why you'd count it at the database level and sum it at the projection level, because you're getting, the count is returning 1, 5, 10 events. Summing that will give you the correct total of counts in your report. So we now have two measures, one that's got a count and one that's just got the, if you go back to the duration for me, Eric, this one still doesn't have the aggregation function because we removed it. So if we now create a query that uses both these measures, let's have a look at the SQL that's generated. Maybe just username, I guess. Oh, yep. All right, so what it's doing is it's actually counting the event ID, but it's just leaving the duration as it is, but then it's grouping by the duration, even though the object is set as a measure. What do you think this is going to do, Eric?
Will essentially give you the wrong results, because if there are any events that are event types that have the exact same duration in milliseconds, it'll look like it should be rolled up into one row.
Yep. So
instead of giving us the total.
Yeah. So you're going to get incorrect results. So, and that's the mortal sin for a universe developer. If your user can get the wrong results because you haven't designed the universe correctly, then you need to redo the universe. So this is exactly why you should use a standard approach of doing database aggregation, especially database aggregation, and setting the projection function correctly. And if you have a reason why you don't want to do database aggregation, you need to set the universe in a particular way so that users can't get the wrong results.
Awesome. Anything else on it?
I'll stop talking because I could talk about this for so long. You can tell I'm very passionate about it.
Yes, we better end before Josh reaches through the podcast and smacks you for bad universe design. Well, cool. So hopefully you've learned a little bit more about how the projection functions work in universe design. Also, hopefully you're thinking a little bit more about application controls inside the universe, ensuring that row limits and time limits are set appropriately so that if, in the worst case scenario, these kinds of scenarios exist within your semantic layer, you're not going to let your users run away with your database and the business objects just because they're pulling back 30 million rows of data into a microcube. That's bad, in case you were wondering. So let's put a bow on it. Thanks, Josh.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Have a good one. Cheers.
This podcast is hosted and sponsored by EVtechnologies. Visit us on the net at savethecms.com.
D-Slayer!